Hello, everyone. Welcome to Luohan Webinar. Today, we are very happy to have the Professor Benjamin Faber. Benjamin Faber is an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the UC Berkeley. He also currently serves as a research associate at the MBR, a research fellow at the CEPR, a consultant at the World Bank, and also a fellow at the Luohan Academy. Professor Faber's research focuses on the intersection of international trade and development economics, focusing on how globalization broadly defined and shapes economic livelihood in developing countries. His research has been published in top journals, including American Economic Review and Review of Economic Studies and Journal of Public Economics. Today, he's going to talk about his paper, The Responsible Sourcing, Theory and Evidence from Costa Rica. Professor Faber, the floor is yours. And as I told you before, the seminar will be 1.5 hours. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for having me. And I just want to tip my hat to the organizers. I think the Luohan Academy has really created a great community with an interesting lineup of speakers and projects and collaborations coming out. So I just wanted to say chapeau. That's a really great thing that you've created. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and you can all let me know if that works well.
Yeah, works well.
Okay, perfect. And please interrupt me at any time with any questions. You can just jump in and treat it like a regular seminar. That'd be great. Okay, so in this paper, we are studying the effects of so-called responsible sourcing. So let's jump into it and define what the motivation is. Multinational corporations around the world are increasingly imposing these responsible sourcing standards on their suppliers. So this is not, the first wave of corporate social responsibility, where multinationals have tried to treat their own workers and their own working conditions very well across countries. That was sort of the first wave. This is sort of the second wave, where it's not just what I do in-house, but it's also the people who want to sell to me, and then eventually the people who sell to those people that are supposed to abide by some minimum standards. And those standards often include working conditions, requirements on wage floors, worker benefits, minimum hours, safety standards, worker representation, and such. And I'll talk more what that looks like in our setting. These policies are commonly termed supplier codes of conduct, and the stated objectives of these supplier codes of conduct are to homogenize, working conditions across countries, and especially benefit workers in low and middle income countries. There's been an explosion of these practices. I'm sure you've all seen many advertisements about this from your favorite multinational corporation. But there are a number of questions that I don't think we have good either theory or empirical evidence. The first question to ask is like, is this just hot air? Do they just put it on their website? And these contracts are not really binding, or they're not well enforced. If they're not just hot air, and if they impact exposed suppliers and their workers, then the question is this a good idea or is it a bad idea? And ideally, we don't just want to think of one firm rolling these policies out. In the context that we'll study, I'll show you, it's 40% of domestic production that is affected by supplier codes of conduct. So that naturally, poses some questions in general equilibrium, not just looking at, one event study of one firm rolling these things out, but thinking about it with the labor markets and the output markets in mind. So there's some evidence that I will go over in the related literature, but I think it's fair to say that there's relatively little existing theoretical work or sufficient empirical evidence on these topics. So what we try to do in this paper, it has three main blocks. First, we wanted to actually write down a theory and help us, help ourselves think through what the general equilibrium implications could be, under which conditions responsible sourcing could be a good thing, under which conditions it may not be a good thing. So theoretically, we study responsible sourcing. We're going to do that both in partial equilibrium, so these comparative statics that I list here. These are the effects of like one multinational rolling out a supplier code of conduct to its supply network, and just seeing an, oops, sorry, I don't know what's going on here. If that was me, that was weird. Okay, so this, oh, wow. That must be something on my computer happening. Sorry for that. Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. I do have a Lenovo, just just to assign blame here. Wow, I don't know what's happening.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, take your time.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, this seems to be better now. I'm gonna switch back. I'm so sorry. Okay,
No problem.
here we go. I don't know what happened. So we're going to use the theory to study both what we should see in the empirical evidence. So, individual events that we can take to the data to understand what we're going to find in the data, and then also to step beyond comparative statistics and think about the economy as a whole. So derive the welfare implications for different types of workers. When I say responsible sourcing, what you should have in mind going to the model is we're going to focus on working conditions. So we're going to model responsible sourcing as me, a multinational buyer, imposing to all my suppliers, anybody who wants to sell to me, to pay an extra labor-related cost that is above the current market rate. That could either be nominal compensation, or it could be higher labor costs due to benefits, social security payments, safety standards, and so forth. And I'm going to, talk to you about how that jives with what we're going to do empirically, and also whether this is the right way to think about this, whether the data is going to speak to this. And it's happening again. Okay, I'm just gonna, is it okay if I go out of the full screen and just zoom in a bit? I don't know if that's gonna help it. Can everybody still see everything? And I'm just gonna X this.
Yeah,
Does that work?
Yeah,
Does that work?
I think.
Okay, let's hope it doesn't happen again. I really don't know what's happened. Sorry. Okay, so then in the theory, we try to think broadly about it. We have different hypotheses about the motivation of why multinationals roll this out and the market environment. I'm going to flesh out like what's going to matter for the welfare incidence there. In the empirical analysis, we're gonna bring to bear a unique collection of data. And when I say that is, think of the ideal empirical scenario you would like to study what happens if it's hot air or if something's happening. You would want to have firm level data, and you would want to know which firm is exposed to these policies by pre-existing sales relationships to a given multinational. Ideally, you would want to, link the workers at that firm in employer-employee data, so you can study not just the outcomes of firms, before and after, but also the outcomes of workers. So think of the empirical counterfactual that we're shooting for, which I think we're able to implement, is like, you and I, we're both suppliers. We both sell to multinationals in the same sector, and then the multinational that I sell to in a given year decides to roll out responsible sourcing supplier code of conduct, whereas the other supplier does not experience the same shock in the same period. And then we study the differences in outcomes, looking at the pre-trends and then seeing what happens when you're exposed and I'm not exposed. And we can link this to worker data as well. So we can follow the original worker within those firms and see what happens to their compensation, what happens to their employment, and so forth. So that's what we're going to do in the context of Costa Rica, that has a great, amazing data environment and a really, really capable and research-oriented central bank staff. On top of the Costa Rican data, we then had to basically find, the main explanatory variable of interest, and that is like we were able to observe firm-to-firm transactions in the data. We were able to observe firm identities and link them to multinational ownership. But then we needed to know, of the hundreds of multinationals operating and sourcing in Costa Rica, which ones rolled out a supplier code of conduct with responsible sourcing policies at what time. So we had two independent research teams that did a double-blind data entry, going through all publicly available information, both in Costa Rica as well as in the international media mentions and the multinational websites, which gave us a database of 135 responsible sourcing rollouts during our sample period between 2009 and 2019, out of a sample of 481 multinationals that had subsidiaries on the ground in Costa Rica. And as I mentioned, which was surprising to us, we knew it was prevalent. I didn't quite know how much of production is affected. So by the end of our sample, roughly 40% of non-M&E, so domestic Costa Rican production in all sectors, is selling to a multinational that has an active supplier code of conduct, an active responsible sourcing policy under it. And the main strategy we're going to have is an event study design that I'll walk you through. And then in the final step, we'll combine the two. And then in particular, these event studies are going to be one-to-one relatable to the comparative statics we have in the model, and we're going to use the event study point estimate to estimate some of the key parameters of the model. And once we have the calibrated model, we can then ask questions such as, if we go from a level of zero responsible sourcing policies in the multinational production sector in Costa Rica to the level that we observe by the end of our sample in 2019, which is this 40% of production affected, what are the welfare implications on different types of workers? And that's what we're doing. So here's please,
yeah, just a quick question. So is this responsible sourcing is type of the regulation or just commitment of the firm?
It's a voluntary standard above and beyond any legal obligations that the multinational commits to. So when you roll out a supplier code of conduct, you can do this by region, but usually you do it globally, as we're going to see. You basically set a list of rules. For example, minimum wages. You can set maximum working hours, maternity leave standards, safety standards, and any other regulations, environmental or labor related, that suppliers must adhere to. And then you also I think it's know what's happening. Okay, and then you also specify enforcement mechanisms, which is usually done by third-party audits. But this is completely voluntary, and it's usually very outward oriented. It's like widely advertised. And we'll talk about like why multinationals would want to do this.
So similar to ESG, some commitments the companies are doing these days.
Exactly, yeah. So there's many terms floating around. There was corporate social responsibility, and then we wanted to have a term that's specific on suppliers, which is responsible sourcing.
Okay.
I think the OECD or the ILO termed.
Okay, I got it.
But yeah, it's very much related.
Yeah, and also I have one. I have one kind of follow-up questions. I'm not sure whether this kind of a responsible sourcing or conduct code on the supplier is varying a lot across the different multinationals, because right now I think there's no common standard for responsible sourcing. If this kind of a code of conduct vary a lot across different multinationals, then it's hard to evaluate the impact, right? Or is there some to?
Yeah, so we're going to estimate the average impact mainly. I'm also going to show you some heterogeneity by type of supplier affected and by type of multinational rolling this out, but we haven't gone full on and tried to legally dissect the different texts. These are texts. So for each of the events, so this is 137 multinationals. I think it's going to be 165 different supplier codes of conduct that we're going to have in our sample. We haven't gone through and let legal scholars, code them up in terms of enforcement provisions. So it's mainly going to be average, and I'll have some heterogeneity. But yeah, so from my own reading of these texts, there's a great degree of heterogeneity. And what we're going to do here is sort of like the average. Relative to the related literature, that's actually important, I think. So there are some studies that have taken a particular supplier code of conduct and then estimated what happened to the linked suppliers of this one multinational time event. And that's interesting, of course, but of course, it's very specific to one particular set of provisions. And then one of the things we wanted to do here is to have at least, close to the universe in one country for the last decade, to speak to, some sort of average, which is not the universal average, but at least is the average in this set.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll roll and jump in whenever. So here's a preview of the findings. So in the theory, the main takeaway is that the welfare incidence of responsible sourcing in the sourcing country, so the workers that you're trying to affect, is a priori ambiguous. And it's going to depend on the particular model machinery that you build, what you allow for and what you don't. And we're going to speak to like different versions of the model that we have. But even in the most basic version of the model, there's one interplay of two opposing forces that's always going to be there when you look at this from a general equilibrium perspective. So shocking, something like 40% of domestic production. And the first thing that is good for the welfare of domestic workers is that responsible sourcing policies, to the extent that they are not just hot air, but actually increase the payments of firms to labor-related costs in this economy, right? So you're paying a domestic factor higher prices if you want to sell to the multinational, to the extent that that production that's affected is destined for export. So imagine there's a set of suppliers that only produce to the multinationals, and the multinationals only export their goods. In that case, really what the multinational is doing is to implement a unilateral export tax for Costa Rica. They're making foreigners pay more for a domestic factor of production. And if that was the only thing that was going on, then this would be welfare improving through a classical terms of trade. So that would, well, that would benefit domestic agents, and intuitively you would make foreigners pay more without them retaliating against you, right? So this is the standard thing why we have trade agreements, because this to the first order is a welfare improving for any country to implement. What's counteracting that force is that responsible sourcing also introduces a labor market distortion. Some firms have to pay this wedge on a certain type of labor that we're going to specify, and other firms don't. So there's a distortion going on. If you work from a completely undistorted initial equilibrium, which we're going to talk about, like even in the simplest set. So that labor market distortion is welfare decreasing to the extent that the affected suppliers do not just supply to foreigners, but to the extent that they also produce for domestic production. And an important feature of these supplier codes of conduct is they are written for a firm supplying to you, so the legal entity. So you can't be a supplier and say, like, look, we only use this part of the of the production facility for your products, and only on this production line are we paying the workers more, or do we have safety standards? It's for the firm as a whole, so affecting all of production, both to the responsible sourcing buyer that rolls this out, but also to all your other clients if enforcement is there. Okay, so they're written like this. So that means that some of the cost increase and the distortion leaks into the domestic price index. That's the way that in the model is going to work. And these things are working in opposite directions, and one can outweigh the other. Okay, so it can be zero, it can be negative, and it can be positive in a general sense. And then on top of that, like moving away from the simplest possible case in general equilibrium, you can of course complicate things in a realistic way, and that is to say that the cost increase maybe is not fully passed through to the multinational because they have buyer market power. And then of course you can see how that would act against the beneficial export tax to the extent that there is any, if domestic producers have to eat the cost and not pass it on to the multinational fully. Or if there's productivity consequences related to responsible sourcing, or if the multinational implements responsible sourcing because they actually want to shift their output demand. All of these things we're going to allow for in the model. They are going to matter for welfare, but the basic interplay that is ambiguous is always going to be there. So it's like theoretically unclear if this is a good idea for workers in the sourcing country. So in the empirics, and otherwise I don't think I would be talking about this paper here, we find that responsible sourcing is not just hot air. Okay, and this was partly surprise to our entire research team. This paper on responsible sourcing had originally started in the Congo for me, and then things didn't work out there. It was about cobalt sourcing in the electronics industry that fell through for various reasons that I'm happy to talk about. And then we wanted to study responsible sourcing in different contexts, and Costa Rica was not the context I first had in mind, right? Like you can think of responsible sourcing as like banning child labor or banning forced labor agreements, or wearing a helmet at a construction site. That's not the Costa Rican setting. So not what we had in mind. But in the Costa Rican setting, we find that it does seem to be not just hot air. So I thought of Costa Rica as a middle-income country with relatively good institutions, where maybe these policies on positively selected firms selling to multinationals may not be binding. But what we find empirically is that 4 years after you are an exposed supplier, so take that example, you're supplying to Pepsi, I'm supplying to Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola rolls out a responsible sourcing code of conduct on its suppliers in 2012. Coca-Cola, in my example, doesn't do it. What happens to our timeline of firm and worker outcomes differently? So 4 years after, on average, that exposure event, and exposure means you were selling, in my example, you were selling to Pepsi and you were selling to Coca-Cola in the year before Pepsi rolled it out. 4 years after that event, that group of exposed firms that used to be sellers have 7% less sales and 6% less total employment. The incomes of workers who stay at the firm among low-wage workers, the lowest quarter of workers, 25% in the national wage distribution, they see their earnings increase, and the relative employment share of low-wage workers relative to high-wage workers, which is the bottom quarter relative to the top quarter of workers in Costa Rica in the national wage distribution, goes down by 14%. So, and then we have additional evidence that I'm going to show you, but what seems to be happening here is that responsible sourcing increases labor-related costs that are concentrated among initially low-wage workers, and that has real consequences on exposed suppliers and their workers. And this is in the average environment that we observe. We're not saying that there's perfect enforcement, that there's no cheating going on, that every single responsible sourcing policy must have fight. We're saying on average this is what we see. and we don't have a good different explanation for it, and it paints a coherent picture. I'm going to show you what else. So in the quantification, when we then use the empirical evidence to calibrate the model, we find, the first thing to say is, like, in the aggregate, it's small positive gains, but nothing big. A minor gain that wouldn't be a big deal. But these policies have meaningful distributional implications. And in particular, if you take the 25% of Costa Rican workers that we label as initially low-wage workers, 30% of the low-wage workers in Costa Rica are directly exposed to an RS policy by 2019, in the final year of our data. And the simulation of an equilibrium that does not have these policies by the multinational sector to a second equilibrium that does have the extent of responsible sourcing policies that we see in the data, they see a meaningful welfare increase in real wages, so in their real incomes, by about 8%. However, the remaining 70% of low-wage workers that were not directly exposed to these policies, they were not ex ante employed at suppliers that were supplying to multinationals who end up rolling out a responsible sourcing policy. They see their welfare going down. Why? Because aggregate labor demand for low-wage workers is going down. This increases the price index for low-wage workers in the economy. And the suppliers to multinationals who are complying with these policies substitute away from low-wage workers, and the local price index is going up because of this leakage that I was talking about. Okay, so the main takeaway is that these responsible sourcing policies, if you look at it from a micro level, without general equilibrium effects on wages, you do see elements that are consistent with meaningful cost increases, even in the Costa Rican setting. And if you then go to the aggregate, if you think it through, if you affect 40% of domestic production, there are potentially unintended indirect effects, knock-on effects on workers in these economies that may not be as you wanted to have it in these policies. So in our quantitative results, this would be bad news for the majority of low-wage workers in Costa Rica, who of course are originally the beneficiaries of this policy. All right. There's a number of related literatures we relate to. There's a literature on the effects of FDI in developing countries, a literature on the effects of RS programs. So that's a more recent, relatively small still literature of empirical studies that have, for example, used the collapse of the Rana Plaza building that was a Gap supplier in Bangladesh, and the subsequent increases in the safety standards among industry associations in the Bangladeshi textile industry. So you have a lot of interesting studies. There is a recent really nice randomized controlled trial by Laura Boudreau at Columbia Business School. So there is a literature focused on particular cases. What we're trying to do here is to, number one, think through theoretically in an open economy setting if this is good or not good, and then secondly have a database that has hundreds of these events so we can say something about the average. There's a literature of fair trade on fair trade that's obviously related, and on corporate social responsibility that I'll just jump over. Okay, so here's what's on the menu for the rest of the talk. I'm going to walk you through the basics of the model and the interplay of the welfare channels, just in the theory, and we're going to try to be quick on that. Then I'll talk about data and context, walk you through the event study evidence, combine the evidence with the model, and then end with a welfare analysis at the end. Any questions at this point? That would be good.
Oh yeah, actually I have one clarifying question. So, for example, if suppose I'm the supplier to the beverage industry in the Costa Rica, and I have to supply to the Pepsi and a Coke, and if Coke actually imposed the responsible sourcing on me, the increased cost also going to affect my relation with the Pepsi and me. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. So and one of the nice things of having these firm-to-firm transactions data that you usually get from like VAT tax records in Costa Rica, it's slightly different, but you also have them, is that we can look at what happens, right, to exposed suppliers relative to non-exposed suppliers on their transactions to other buyers, right? And actually, that's going to be the moment we're going to use to tell you that in the end, I'm going to find that the cost increase to employing low-wage workers in Costa Rica is on average 12%. Okay, so you pay 12% compared to what you used to pay to low-wage workers if you want to comply with responsible sourcing policies. And the way that we're going to estimate that through the lens of the model is to say, here's a group of exposed suppliers to non-exposed suppliers. What happens to their sales to non-responsible sourcing buyers, right? That tells me something about what happens to your market share relative to the market share of other firms that don't have a responsible sourcing shock in the competitive market where you're competing with other firms, right? When I know what happens to your market share compared to a different firm, and I know something about the demand that these firms are facing, then I can use that to back out the implied cost shock that must have happened in your firm. I'm also going to show you what happens to earnings and paternity leave of these workers, but that's how we're going to do it. So yeah, that's going to be important.
So in Costa Rica, there are a lot of the suppliers who are supplying to multiple multinationals, or
there are some, yeah.
There's some, okay. Because I thought that most of them are just like a subsidiary of the one company, so they are just like having a bilateral relationship.
I'll talk to you about the data. One of the things that was surprising to me, so when I first, started thinking about this project in Costa Rica, I was thinking of like a manufacturing supplier of like tubes or whatever, supplying to a multinational that has a vertical integration and then sells it elsewhere. The majority of the firms, because we're looking at subsidiaries of multinationals that are actually on the ground in Costa Rica, and that ends up being important because the majority of the firms that are exposed are in services. Okay, so think of cleaning services, repair services, car services, furniture delivery services, all of the stuff that you need to run an office. These are all suppliers that by definition fall under the supplier code of conduct. So it's not just your manufacturing suppliers that have like large plants, that sell like to multiple multinationals. The median size of exposed suppliers, I think, is going to be something like 7 employees. So it's going to be relatively small firms if you just count the number of firms.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Hi, I'm thinking about the worse off of the low-wage labor or employees who are worse off. The ones are not exposed to the outsourcing. So I'm thinking whether this is a result of the general equilibrium setup, multi-sector general equilibrium model. Because if you think about the Stoper-Samuelson theorem, well, usually the multinational corporations, well, they do outsourcing and they represent the higher productivity industry. And if labor in that industry, the wage of those outsourcing labor get higher, then comparatively labor is not cheap. Labor is not a cheaper good, and compared with capital or commodities themselves. So but still there is a chance for the labor in other lower industry get higher, catch up. This is what Stoper-Samuelson theorem says. So I'm thinking that in a general equilibrium model, multi-sector general equilibrium model, because of the setup, because of the limited resources, the capital, the labor, then it usually will generate the results that if one sector, the wage in one sector goes up, then the wage in the other sectors go down. That's the typical result. There's always a check and balance in the general equilibrium models. But if we relax this framework, perhaps, well, we may get the results that in a longer time span, then ultimately the wage from all different industries will ultimately catch up.
Yeah, I think so I fully agree. This is like, the negative. So all the welfare results that we have are going to be through the lens of the model that I'm going to present. And just to be super clear, so what I will be able to show you, hopefully convincingly, if you believe our data and identification strategy, that all sits in here. So I will be able to tell you what happens at exposed firms and what happens to their workers compared to non-exposed firms. But of course, that is a completely partial equilibrium element, right? Like there are hundreds of multinationals active in Costa Rica. One of them, in my event study, one of them hits a bunch of suppliers that used to be selling to that. But the overall wages, the overall labor markets and product markets are going to be unaffected in these event studies, just by definition of how we estimate these things. But when we then say, okay, so that's all interesting, and as I try to argue, like these pieces of evidence, they seem consistent with the story in which labor costs increase at these on average, right? Like labor costs increase after you've been exposed to supply code of conduct, and I'll show you many more results. Then we want to ask, well, what happened in Costa Rica to the welfare of workers now that they've been now that 40% of the domestic production is under it? And that's a counterfactual that I don't, have a regression on. I don't have Costa Rica in 100 different parallel universes, not yet, and can't run that. So yes, so we use the theory to then tell us, look, the theory is going to be consistent with what we find in the data. So it's going to be consistent with, if you want to think about it, the causal effects in partial equilibrium. But of course, the theory makes additional assumptions about labor markets, about functional forms, about the competitive environment. And, of course, we want to take it with a grain of salt. I do think that these insights are at least intriguing and should trigger, number one, a little bit of caution when jumping on the bandwagon of responsible sourcing, and number two, mainly additional work. And I'll, like related to Stopper Samuelson or other, or other industry structures, I'll tell you different model assumptions and how they would affect the welfare. A big one, at least in our mind, was if you don't have perfectly competitive labor markets, and if the domestic firms have labor market power, monopoly power in labor markets, and you have an initial wage that is inefficiently depressed, it's inefficiently low because of labor market power in the domestic labor market, then in principle, you could have a second best rationale for multinationals rolling out these policies and imposing, effective wage floors. And we're going to entertain that possibility in the model because we didn't just want to come down on one side ex ante, but we're not going to find the comparative statics for that case. And then we're going to, lead in the other model trees that we have. But I'll be talking about this. Thanks for the comment. All right, let me start with an outline of the model. So in its most basic versions, there's Costa Rica and the rest of the world. There is people who have preferences that we know and love. These are CES preferences that are asymmetric with variety-specific omega shifters. There's countries indexed by K, that's home and foreign, so rest of the world. Varieties of firms that people consume are indexed by omega. There's a demand shifter that's going to play a role later, and there's a demand elasticity, which is sigma here that we know. We're going to work with two types of workers, partly foreseeing what we're going to see in the empirical analysis. We're going to have initially low wage workers and initially high wage workers. And they're imperfectly substitutable in production with an elasticity of substitution rho. And in the baseline, there's not going to be employment. There's perfectly inelastic labor supply, and all of the proceeds of the firms are reattributed to labor. So it's the only factor gain in this simple analysis. When it comes to firms, we have heterogeneous firms in the domestic sector. So think of like a Melitz model of domestic firms. Those domestic firms can produce both on the domestic markets, selling to domestic agents. They can also export, and they can sell to the subsidiaries of multinationals in Costa Rica. When you sell on the export market, just in the Melitz model, it's going to be selection. There's going to be fixed cost of doing so. So more productive firms are going to be doing it. When you sell to a multinational subsidiary, that's also going to be selection. That's also going to be fixed cost. And then, the least productive firms are only going to sell on the domestic market, and then you have a hierarchy of this. The multinational sector is, just one homogeneous sector that employs both domestic labor as well as purchases domestic inputs from the Costa Rican suppliers. To produce for its international plan. The baseline model has monopolistic competition as in any quantitative trade model, and then we're going to relax that when we talk about different hypotheses of the market environment in responsible sourcing. So in this environment, what is going to be responsible sourcing in our model? In our model, responsible sourcing is going to be a multinational announcing that if you sell to me, then for the low wage type of workers, you have to pay a wedge, a rate tau above the current labor cost that you used to be paying. In the model, that's equivalent to the wage. In the real world, this could be both the nominal earnings of workers. It could also be labor-related costs that you don't necessarily see in the paycheck of workers. And that policy applies to, in the model, low wage workers, and it's not binding for high wage workers. And that's basically targeted at what we saw in the data and what I'm going to show you, where the wage increases are coming from and where the employment effects are going to be concentrated. So then we want to entertain a number of different hypotheses that are all going to matter for the welfare incidence of responsible sourcing. The first one is, why are multinationals doing this? And then, you know, in the theoretical literature on corporate social responsibility, you know, there's like two basic branches. One, the firm is doing it for altruistic purposes that are outside of profit maximization because stakeholders care about it, and that's easy. It's just like they do it like exogenously. The other one is they want to maximize profits, and as economists, we're always, you know, we're always prone to think in that direction. So how would we model, you know, this for a profit motive, and that matters for welfare? And that is that maybe the clients, the consumers that multinational firms face in global markets, their demand is a function of the sourcing practices that they have. So when they come and announce the blue TAO, right, like the responsible sourcing policy, when they announce that in world markets, then they experience a positive demand shift to their competitors, conditional on prices. So they're doing it as a profit motive. On one end, maybe your input cost goes up in the sourcing, but you're trading that off, you know, optimally with a potential increase in demand that you get at the same level of prices. So maybe there's a demand shock going on. And, you know, that's a possibility that we want to entertain and then try to estimate in the data. The second one is how much is passed through. So multinational corporations are not, you know, not naturally thought of as like, you know, tiny firms without any degree of market power. They're usually conglomerates, and, you know, they have a lot of buyer power, at least anecdotally. So we want to allow for only a fraction of the increase in the cost that responsible sourcing takes, that TAO, to potentially being passed through to input prices of the multinational. And that's another conduct parameter that we want to estimate. And of course, that's going to matter for welfare in the home country, you know, making the assumption on, do you pass the cost on fully to, you know, foreign prices, or do you have to eat some of those costs yourself? And then the third bullet is not something we had in mind initially, but after talking to people in the space, you know, maybe it is true that when you announce responsible sourcing codes of conduct for all your suppliers, the multinational also has incentives to roll out other logistical policies that may include transfers of, you know, technology or training to increase the labor productivity at the exposed suppliers. Again, that was not something that we first had in mind, but we, you know, it was mentioned to us and we wanted to allow for it. Of course, that would be a good thing for the home country in general equilibrium. If, you know, on average, there are increases in labor productivity due to transfers of know-how or technology by the multinational that tend to accompany responsible sourcing. And then finally, you know, it's the labor market story that I just mentioned, which is in gray here because we're not going to find evidence in terms of the comparative statics that would speak to this. But it could be the case that the initial wages are marked down because the suppliers have monopoly power in labor markets. And then, of course, in principle, it could be a good thing for the economy to increase wages. So when a monopolistic firm sees an exogenous increase in the wages, they're going to move up their labor supply curve that they're facing, right? Firms now have, you know, sloped labor supply curves. And if you see a small increase in the required wages of firms under a model with labor market power, what you expect is that firms actually increase employment due to a wage increase rather than the opposite. Of course, profits are going to come down, but both the employment and the sales of these firms are supposed to go up. And that could be a good thing in this economy. So, you know, with these different elements that the model nests in it, we're then, the first step that we're going to use that model for is to derive comparative statics that we're going to take to the data. And I'm going to show you these comparative statics, expressions, like what happens to the total sales of the exposed supplier group? What happens to the sales of suppliers who are complying with a policy on the intensive margin to the multinational? What happens to the sales to non-responsible sourcing buyers, right? So these are all comparative statics that with the model machinery, we're going to get closed form expressions for, and we can link them to the data and use that for parameter estimation, which is what we're going to do. So there's going to be an exposed group. So think of that as the intent to treat effect. So these are suppliers that were supplying to the multinational before they announced the policy. Not all of these exposed suppliers are going to continue supplying to the multinational through the lens of the model. And then in the data, we're going to see if there's an intensive margin and an extensive margin, right? Like in the model, there's going to be some selection to selling to a multinational. If you're just above that cutoff and it's still a positive deal for you, but not great in terms of profits. And then the multinational says, look, you also have to change your, you have to change the rules by which you produce. Then if it was a tiny fraction of your income, you're just going to walk away. If this multinational was a big fraction of your income and you're above that cutoff by a wide margin, you may comply because it's worthwhile for you, despite the increase in cost. Okay. So an overview of the comparative statics, and I'm going to show you the expressions and show you how we link that to data, is this. And basically, I just want to show you this because in a labor monopsony model compared to all the other variants that we have, you should see that the sales to the responsible sourcing multinational on the intensive margin among the compliers is going to go up, and you should see that the sales to non-responsible sourcing buyers is unambiguously going to go up because firms are moving up the labor supply. And we're going to find the opposite of that. And then we're going to basically discard of that, in terms of model selection, we're going to discard of that family tree of models and come down to a model that does not have significant labor market power among the exposed supply. Okay, so now let me walk you through what we learned in terms of responsible sourcing, in terms of welfare. And for that, I'm going to strip down the model a little bit. So the responsible sourcing is now going to be this set of conduct parameters. The cost shock to low wage labor, the potential productivity increase among the exposed firms, the potential demand shock to output sourcing from multinationals in the domestic market, and the extent of cost pass-through from domestic suppliers to the multinational of the cost increase tab. Okay, so that describes the responsible sourcing policy going from 0 to 1. I'm going to strip down the model, make it simple, and I'm going to get a very, very neat and simple general equilibrium first order welfare expression for the representative agent in Costa Rica. When we do the welfare analysis that I'm going to show you at the end, I'm going to take the full model to the simulation and not rely on the simplified version. So this is just for intuition. The same forces apply in the more complicated model, but you don't get neat closed form solution. Okay. So what happens, what's the trade-off with responsible sourcing when a large segment of multinational production that demands domestic inputs roll out these policies that, with this set of conduct parameters? Forget about the last two terms. So this is, something good that happens to domestic welfare if labor productivity goes up at exposed suppliers. And this W prot basically scales the size of that in the aggregate incomes of people in the economy. And then it's also good if the multinational experiences a positive demand shock, because that means increased input demand from your economy. And again, scaled to the appropriate size of multinational demand to the first order, which is this WD here. So these are simple terms that are going to be good for welfare if they're operating. But if they're not operating, you have an interplay that sits here. The light blue one, so this chi L times tau hat, that is the effective export tax that is due to responsible sourcing. Okay, so this is the cost share of low wage workers that are affected with the cost increase in the cost of firms. Okay, so the cost share of low wage workers in the cost of production, which is going to be 19% for our group in Costa Rica, and this is the size of their increase in the effective cost you have to pay for this factor. So if all of the production that is affected by responsible sourcing were exported, then this blue thing here would be the first order welfare gain due to a unilateral export tax for domestic Costa Rican workers. Okay, and that would be, just like in the gains from trade literature, a very well-defined element. When you click on the W tax here, you have all your own trade shares with yourself that show up there. So this is the gain from an export tax in your exports if nothing else is happening. And that gain is mediated by, number one, the amount that you pass through the cost to multinational and foreign buyers. So if that's not one, right, then that's not good for the export tax. It makes it lower. And what is capital lambda? Capital lambda is the fraction of domestic consumption. So by intermediates or by final consumers of domestic consumption that is affected, that is basically produced by suppliers who are under responsible sourcing codes of conduct. So that's the 38% figure in our example. Okay, and that's the leakage, that these costs leak into your price index due to a labor market distortion. So you can see that, forgetting about these good things, that if they're in operation, that's good for domestic welfare. What's going to be determining for the representative agent in the sourcing country is to what extent there's leakage into the domestic economy, and to what extent there's cost pass-through to a first order. And then we also derive welfare expressions for different types of workers, for the low wage workers and the high wage workers, and for the exposed group of workers within those groups where most of the action is going to. Any questions about the basic theoretical setting? Again, the theory is going to come back when I show you the counterfactuals. Okay, so data and context. Costa Rica is a great data environment. I encourage everybody to get busy researching in Costa Rica. So use 7 administrative data sets that existed before we did the study, and then we're going to combine that with our own data collection for responsible sourcing events. So we have the firm-to-firm transactions data for Costa Rican firms. We can link that to the employer-employee data. We have the corporate tax returns that give us outcomes for these firms. We have the customs records that give us trade flows, and we have the foreign ownership registry that we use to identify subsidiaries of multinationals in Costa Rica. And we're able to link the multinationals with subsidiaries in Costa Rica to some of their global outcomes in the Orbis database. So we don't just observe the sales and the employment at the local subsidiary, but also at the group level. And we're going to do some robustness check using NGO campaigns against multinational groups to see if that coincides with the rollouts. So from these data, we're going to get a sample of 481 multinationals with some small sales cutoff, just to make it feasible, of that ever had a subsidiary that sourced in this period with this average amount per year, that accounts for 80% of their production. And then for these 481 M&E subsidiaries, we then have these 2 double-blind research teams that go out and come up between the years 2009 and 2019, any publicly announced or filed rollouts of anything related to responsible sourcing. Okay, it doesn't have to be called a supplier code of conduct. It doesn't have to be announced on the website. It doesn't have to be, mentioned in a newspaper. And we get these 2 databases, we overlay them, and then we code them to see which ones of them have at least some provisions related to working conditions. And that's how we get our estimation sample of 165 rollouts done by 135 of these 481 firms that affected, at the end, it was close to 40% of domestic production. At the beginning of our sample, I think it was 18% of domestic production by 2009. Why do we start in 2009? Because we have the firm-to-firm transaction data from 2008. So only for rollouts after 2009 can we link exposed suppliers to these rollouts. Some descriptive statistics. The first set of bullets is not super surprising. So these multinationals are large and largely based in Europe and in Northern America. They're all over the place in terms of their own sectors. So these are examples from manufacturing, it's Boston Scientific, from services, Cisco Systems, from retail, Walmart, from agriculture, Standard Fruit Company. These are in our sample. What was more surprising is that the majority of the exposed suppliers is not a manufacturer. The manufacturing is 10%, agriculture is roughly 10%. The rest of that is what we usually describe as services. So there's explicit services and there's what they call retail, but retail includes repair services, cleaning services, and so on. And this one, these supplier codes of conduct don't just hit, large manufacturing firms that are supplying to global supply chains. They also affect local service. One way to rationalize what we're going to find, which was surprising to us, the relatively strong negative impacts on the exposed suppliers, is that Costa Rica is an environment that I would describe as follows. They have very strong regulations, which is why initially I thought maybe Costa Rica is not the most promising country to study this, but we have amazing data, so let's try it. They have very strong regulations, so they have the highest minimum, or among the highest minimum wage standards compared to the median wages that you see in the OECD. They're at the upper end of the social security payments that firms have to do. They have strong environmental standards. They have strong safety standards, worker representation. However, among the working conditions, they also have very weak enforcement. And very weak enforcement, and that's not us that are just saying this exposed, like people have found this. So roughly a third of formal sector workers are paid below the median wage, and that's not that's actually not only at the beginning of a sample. That's like in 2017, still the case. And then the Minister of Labor like openly stands up and says, look, we have enough resources for less than 10% of firms. And what you can think about that is if you're a small and medium producer in Costa Rica, you're essentially unaudited and unmonitored, and there's no strong enforcement of existing regulations. Lots of workers are informal. Even if you are a formal worker, there's nothing that ensures that you get the codes that are on the book officially for you. Now, what that means in terms of responsible sourcing is that the very minimum that a responsible sourcing policy does is to say you have to adhere to the labor standards and regulations and the law of the land in which you produce. So in Costa Rica, even that minimum bottom that any responsible source of conduct will, responsible sourcing code of conduct will have, even that could be a meaningful policy change for firms. You can't have any informal labors anymore. The ones that used to be formal, you're going to be audited to make sure that all the social security payments are in line, the minimum wage standards, the maximum working hours are met, and so forth. Okay, so that's how I think about it. And then put that together with the majority of exposed firms in services sectors and relatively small firms, and that's an environment where I see much more plausible bites rather than just hot air of these policies. Okay. Any? Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Can you give us like some example of what type of the companies they are in the service sector in Costa Rica? Because I just want to have some picture of who they are.
You mean the exposed firms, or you mean the multinationals?
Oh no, exposed. Yeah, in Costa Rica.
So I have a basic breakup here, but not more than that. So the median number of employees, I don't have it here. So the average is 16. The median is 8, and I actually think the average may have changed. I think the average may be like 30 or something like that, and then the median is 8. You have anything that a firm needs to operate locally, right? So if you're Cisco Systems or if you are Boston Scientific, like that's great, and you do your global supply chain looks very differently, but you have an office with employees locally, like a subsidiary, and that subsidiary has sales relationships to all kinds of local services. So the ones that I mentioned, cleaning services are universal, repair services, the transportation service that you have, the drivers, all of that.
Okay, so they are usually really like a small sized supplier.
Not all of them, right? So you see, like if it's true from recollection that the average is 30 and the median is 8, like there's going to be dispersion. There are going to be these super positively selected, large employers that are selling to multinationals, and of course, on average, there's still positive selection, right? It is just that not all firms that sell to multinationals are, the superstar firms that I had in mind when we went into this project.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay, how do we use these data empirically, and then link that to the competitive statistics before? We're going to define exposed suppliers as suppliers that we're supplying to multinational that rolls out in the year later, right? So we have the rollout events of the 135 multinational. Sorry, of the 135 multinationals, we have the rollout events. We know who was supplying to these multinationals the year before, and we're going to use that in an event study design to see what happens to total sales to different buyers, employment, wages of these employees, and also the event study on the multinational. So the basic design is this one. So think of I as a supplier, firm I. In a 4-digit sector, I think there's close to 400 of them in Costa Rica at a year T, right? So this is firm level panel data, where the event timeline hits you with a particular responsible sourcing code of conduct that was rolled out between 2009 and 2019 if you were selling to that multinational. And this is only a sample of firms that were suppliers to multinationals. Okay, so this is the logic that I told you. We're all suppliers to multinationals, but we get hit by responsible sourcing codes of conduct at different times. And then there's a firm fixed effect and a sector by type. So what could go wrong here? It's an event study, so we're going to look at the pre-trends, obviously. But what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Like the first thing is that multinationals targeted the timing of these supplier codes of conduct to shocks in Costa Rica, right? So there was a productivity shock in Costa Rica or something else that was going on, and I chose to roll out supplier code of conduct in a way that's not picked up by tree trends, but like at that moment where something happens in Costa Rica. So to address that, we're going to show you the event study, and then also do an instrumental variable strategy where we only we have all these codes of conduct, and we know whether these codes of conduct were rolled out globally for every country in the world that the multinational sources from, or whether it was targeted at Central America or Costa Rica, or whatever it may be. And we're only going to use the global rollouts, which is 80% of the rollout. So yeah, that's going to work. It's not crazy to think that multinationals don't time their global supply policies to particular shocks that happen in a particular labor market in Costa Rica. The second thing we're going to do is to use, the recent applied econometrics literature on difference and differences. So, the main, the early criticism to difference and differences, if you take before and after and just estimate the average effect of a policy shock before and after, then if there's dynamic effects going on, then in a given period, the control group includes the before treated because their treatment status doesn't change. And if they're still trending upward or downward because of the treatment, then obviously that's going to bias your estimates. So one good thing you can do there is to estimate the event study. That buys you a lot. But even once you do the event study, then one of the problems you have is that if different cohorts of the treated, so the exposed suppliers in 2011 have different sets of dynamic effects than the exposed suppliers by the end of the sample in 2017, then that's still an issue. But luckily, Abraham and Sun have written a paper focused on event study designs. And we do it both in the standard two-way fixed effects version, and we do it in the Sun and Abraham estimates. They estimated cohort by cohort specific and then aggregated up subject to the sample sizes of these cohorts. And the results universally look very much the same. And then finally, by the way that we define the treatment of being exposed, there could be a mechanical bias. So these are all supplies to multinationals, but you don't sell to a multinational every year, right? Even if you are a supplier to a multinational. So maybe we're picking out lucky years for the exposed group, right? So in that year, you got a shock and you started selling to a multinational, and that's a good thing for you. And it just dropped on you because of the sporadic nature of these sales. So then we would have artificially, like mechanically, positive pre-trends and then negative post-trends. So what we do for that, which we do see when we don't do that, to control for that, we also put the full timeline of having sold to any multinational at year, eta -1, so at the exposure year. So we're conditioning for having sold to any multinational and then compare your effects to having sold to a multinational that also rolls out a responsible sourcing. And then what you see is that the pre-trends are flat and the post-trends are what they are. We also do, a more ambitious, ask of the data. We have worker by firm data and we have firm to firm data. So we can saturate the model. So for example, when I estimate the effect on worker earnings, I can take a worker by employer fixed effect and just study what happens to the earnings of workers that were at the firm when it was exposed, and then trace them out on the intensive margin, the same workers without selection. And the same thing I can do with firm-to-firm transactions when I want to estimate what happens on the intensive margin of compliers to the multinational. After the shock, I take a buyer-seller fixed effect, and I estimate everything of having sold to the multinational beforehand, estimate just what happens on the transactions after you comply with the policy, because otherwise you drop out and I don't see you. The basic event study at the supplier level, the first one I talked about, is if you take log annual sales of exposed suppliers and compare them over the same timeline to the sales of other suppliers to multinationals in the same 4-digit sector in the same period, then you find that 4 years after, sales go down by roughly 7%, and then this is like this dashed line is when we pool the event period at 4 years or more. Why do I show you -4 and 4? We have a window of 2009 to 2019. Of course, we include all the event dummies in there, right? But we show you 4 to 4 after, just because of sample selection, it gets really sparse, and then the standard errors become large. But when we pool the effect 4 years or more after in a separate event study, where we then pool the final coefficient, this is the effect. So that's the way to read it. This is 4 years after from one event study, and then in the same event study, holding everything else equal, but just pooling the latest effect, it becomes roughly minus 10%. And this is what happens to total firm employment, okay, which goes down in a similar path. We then look into which types of suppliers and which types of multinationals are driving these negative sales effects. So this is by above or below median size of the sector that you're in. And this is saying that this is driven by sectors with relatively small firm sizes. And then if you do services and non-services, you see that this is driven mainly by services suppliers, by that 80% of exposed firms that we have. So relatively small firms and relatively less regulated sectors. That's where the negative effect comes from on the supplier side. We can also do this by types of multinationals. And here, the initial thing was just, take it above and below median, the GDP per capita of the headquarter of the multinational in our sample, and it's driven by multinationals headquartered in richer countries. And of course, correlated with that, multinationals headquartered with better average management scores. In the version of the paper we have now, we also have labor standards, and it works through multinationals that are headquartered in countries with higher labor standard scores. Okay.
So is every point a cumulative effect or just the period by period effect? Because my question is whether every point in your graph is a summation of all the betas by which you assume that the policy should take effect. Because if, for example, every point, for example, at the period 4, and this point estimate is beta 1 plus beta 2 and 2 plus beta 4, then the confidence here, the bar is a confidence band, right? But in case of a cumulative effect, it should be in a confidence, it should be in a super T confidence band, right? For multiple parameters, and that super T confidence band should be larger than the single parameter confidence interval. And in that occasion, it's possible that the super T confidence band is going to cover 0, the horizontal line.
Yeah, so I'm not showing you, any kind of impulse response where I'm adding or multiplying coefficients over time. Like what these point estimates are doing is literally so this is the event timeline. So in year 0, it's when the multinational announces and implements the responsible sourcing code of conduct. And this switches on, like the full timeline of events switches on for suppliers if you were supplying to that multinational question the year before. So for some suppliers, right, this event timeline happens from 2010 onwards, and then 1 year after is 2011, 2 years after is 2012. For some, it happens later or it happens early in the sample. But what these point estimates do is they give you the average effect on your cells in this graph, the average effect on your cells in this, like what I'm pointing at, 1 year after you've been exposed. So 1 year after there has been a policy that you were exposed to, compared to other suppliers, to other multinationals that had different event timelines of responsible sourcing rollouts. And then I compare the exposed group compared to the non-exposed group in a given sector, in a given time period to address that 2011 had higher sales than 2009, and the manufacturing industry saw an increase in growth and the service industry did not. So we're doing everything within these bins. And then we just average this, right? So this is the average effect of being 2 years after an event that you were exposed to among the group of firms that was exposed. So intent to treat. These are not all firms that complied with the policy. These are firms that used to be selling to this policy. For some that is in 2017, for some that is in 2012. But we're not, applying these estimates somehow to these numbers. This is just what the data, quote unquote, like what the data says is the average effect relative to the control group, which is, firms supplying to other multinationals that are not on the same event time.
Then how might doubly robust procedure help within heterogeneity? Because, well, if you aggregate companies, multinational companies from architecture or services or manufacture, well, different industries going to feature different treatment defect. And there's a paper in AER saying that, well, when we have this level of heterogeneity, the average treatment effect is actually a weighted average of many estimators, and some of the weights can be negative. And if the negative part is too large, then it's going to bias the result.
Yeah, so I'm fully with you that there's heterogeneous responses. We do a little bit of the heterogeneity analysis, but of course we are restricted by the sample that we have, right? So as I was saying, I think our team can be proud to be estimating average effects across a whole spectrum of different responsible sourcing policies relative to what's been out there. But of course, I wish I had 25,000 events, and then I could really dig in architecture versus something else. Of course, we don't have that sample size. I think it's a fair attempt to start that analysis, but I fully agree with you that there could be heterogeneities that we're not capturing here. Absolutely, and these are averages that we're going to estimate. So what's happening to the? Yeah, thanks for the question. What's happening to the workers? Oh yeah, please go. Yeah.
Professor, do you also pull the periods before -4 into a dummy? Do you bind up at -4 as well?
No. So in the blue point estimate that I show you, there's all the event study individual years that we can possibly observe. And I don't have it, like, if you know the sample that we have, then you know what the maximum minus and what the maximum positive is in our data, and we don't bin them, which is best practice as far as I understand. And it's also the reason why I'm showing you this guy here in yellow. I think it's meaningful or informative to see what happens on average. But pooling can have its own econometric issues, which is why this guy comes from a different separate regression. Thanks for the question.
But this because you don't have periods smaller than -4. Is that the answer?
Oh no, we have periods smaller than -4, right? So we start like we have a sample of firms that we observed between 2008 and 2019, and we can link exposure events between 2009 and 2019, right? So if there is a firm, yeah, so we have more than 4, and we have less than -4. I'm just showing you -4 to 4 because, of course, as you go out, the sample sizes of the firms that have been as recently treated or as long, as long time treated becomes really small, and the standard errors go up. So I don't want to trust the -13 figure that's like one firm that's showing up. That's the reason.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, please, like keep asking questions that are clarifying, because otherwise I'm going to gloss over it and then people are confused. Thanks for this. Okay, what happens to workers? So here I take a worker by firm fixed effects and the same, sector by time fixed effects, and then you are employed at an exposed firm, and then I follow the workers that were employed at exposed firms to workers that were employed at suppliers to multinationals that over the same event timeline were not exposed. On average, you see a slight uptick of like roughly 2% of all, if you take all the wages. And then if you decompose that effect, it is concentrated among the initially low wage workers. What's the low wage worker? We have the worker data, like the employer-employee data, I think from 2006 onwards. So the first time I see a worker in the data, we're going to rank them in the national distribution of their earnings. And then if I see you for the first time after 2006, then we inflation adjust that, and then we hold that constant. So this is not like you are in whatever percentile every period. It's like I give you a bin of like the bottom 20% of earnings and the top 20% of earnings and the middle of earnings, and then that's just your category, and that is fixed. So you see that increase in wages is around 4.5%. That's driving the average. You see, something in the middle among 50% of workers, and then you see close to nothing among initially high wage workers, which is consistent if you think of what may be the minimum standards in these policies, that they may not be binding for like the management staff and the white collar workers more generally. So it seems to be concentrated among initially low wage workers. Consistent with that, what happens to relative employment? So I told you overall employment is going down. What happens to the employment of the bottom quarter of workers relative to the top quarter of workers? Employment is going down in this graph by slightly less than 10%. That's log. If you allow for the extensive margins, so some firms, don't have any low wage workers anymore afterwards, and you do this in PPML, like in pseudo Poisson maximum likelihood, which is what we're going to use for the calibration. So having the extensive margin in there, this goes to, I think, -15%, which is the figure that I had in the introduction. What happens to sales to different buyers? So this is the intensive margin. So this is taking a buyer-seller fixed effect, taking all the transactions that go to a multinational, and then using the timeline of when the multinational rolls out responsible sourcing to see what happens to the sales transactions of previously linked suppliers to you. And in the labor monopsony model, that should have been unambiguously positive. If anything, we see this to be negative. And then what happens to the intensive and extensive margin sales to an RS active buyer if you were an exposed supplier? So that's both the the compliers and the firms that split. Again, counting 0 sales. So this is sales can go to 0. I'm doing this in PPML. You see that that becomes larger, and that's indicative of both the intensive and extensive margin being in operation. Some firms walk, they used to supply to you, and then you impose a standard and they walk away. And the firms that keep selling to you, if anything, the sales are going to go down rather than up.
One small question. The comparison between higher quantile and low quantiles are interesting, but it suddenly came to me that are the quantiles summable? Because the mean treatment effect are summable, right? But if we are thinking about quantiles, yeah, this one, the right-hand side panel, the bottom quantiles, because quantiles are not summable, right? So how can we justify if we are trying to estimate, well, current effect compared with the previous effect, then with a lot of industries aggregated, how can we justify that it is summable in quantiles?
Yeah, great point, and that may have been confusing. So this is not a quantile regression. We're just breaking it up by quarter of the initial earnings. So think of this as interacting the event studies with, and then actually the point you make on like maybe that's not consistent with the average. So we try to have this specification such that these three groups add up almost exactly to this average, and that's exactly what we do. So we basically run the same regression here, and all we do is to interact all the event study time period dummies with two groups, and then we have three sets of treatment timelines, and that's exactly what I'm showing you here. And these three effects should roughly add up to the average that you see here when you take into account the sample size. Great point.
Thanks.
Professor Faber, I have a follow-up question on the on how I can interpret the coefficient, because when I'm reading your paper, I noticed that you included all periods in your regression, like including the periods before -4 and after -4. But you don't have dummies for those periods before -4. That means that those periods before and the -1 period are both regarded as your control groups, right? So your beta coefficient will be interpreted as the relative changes of y compared to, well, both the groups at -1 and those groups before -4. I'm not sure whether I'm correct or not.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear in my early answer. We have the full set of saturated event time dummies in the event study regression. Everything possible in our sample. Sorry if I wasn't clear. It's not like we don't have these and they are implicitly loading the control group. Okay. The only event study dummy that is dropped because of perfect multicollinearity.
I see. You just didn't report it in the graph, right?
Exactly right. We choose to show between -4 and 4 because if I showed you that graph, then the standard errors would become larger than the page.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Hi Ben. Ben. I have a question about the regression that you talk about, like firms that walk away and change the multinational companies. So I'm curious about in Costa Rica, what's the proportion of the market share between the multinational firms and the direct exporters? I'm thinking about the effect of the entry behavior into the direct export market, not just through the multinationals.
So in the model, if you're a domestic firm, you can sell on all three markets. You can sell to the multinational subsidiary, you can sell to the domestic market, you can also export. Yes, and then is the question like what happens after you've been exposed? What happens to your exports? Is that the question?
Yeah, like just a clarification question about the market share between the direct exporter or the multinational companies.
Like how many firms are selling to the multinational, and like only selling to the multinational, only exporting or doing both, like that?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I don't have that off the top of my mind. But in the model, there's going to be a hierarchy depending on how you switch the fixed cost on, right? Like if the fixed cost for exporting is lower than the fixed cost for selling to the multinational, then you should see the ordering going that way.
Yeah, sure. The export behavior just depend on the fixed cost and the
selection into exporting and the selection into selling to the multinational. And then in the real world, right, like so in the model we have one homogeneous multinational sector, but of course in the real world you have different multinationals and they could have different idiosyncratic productivity cutoffs, right? Like you happen to be a great supplier for me rather than right, and that's all fine. Like there's still going to be an intensive margin among suppliers, and there's going to be people who are going to drop out and say, no, thank you, that's really not worth it. And to a first order, both in the model as well as in the real world, that's going to be determined by how important the sales of that multinational were in your total sales, which of course is going to tell you something of how valuable that relationship was to you, right? And if you have a lot of initial sales going to the multinational, then you're more likely to accept it compared to a buyer where the multinational was just 1% of your sales, and then you're like, I'm not going to change all of my production costs because of you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, so this is, I think, the last event. No, not quite. So this is the final moment I'm going to show you on suppliers and the workers. So this is what happens to the sales to non-RS buyers. Okay, so you're among the exposed group. Again, in a labor market monopsony model, that thing should have been unambiguously positive. What we're seeing is it goes alongside the negative sales response we see on all margins, which is going down. And this is going to be an important moment to quantify what is the effective on average. What is the effective cost increase to you? If I don't just want to use earnings data as the cost, but I want to say, like, you know, in terms of like the market environment, the revealed preferences of your buyers, what happens to your attractiveness compared to non-effective non-affected suppliers in a market that's not affected by responsible sourcing. Okay, what happens to the multinational? Not much. So these are the sales of the subsidiaries of the multinational in Costa Rica. And this is the share of the subsidiary sales in the global sales of the multinational group. And both of them are flat. Okay. So there seem to be, you know, in the reduced form evidence, there seem to be negative effects on exposed suppliers with some earnings increases. There seem to be no meaningful, no significant impacts on either the subsidiary or the share of the subsidiary in global sales. And we're going to use the model to make sense. Okay. So what we want to use this evidence for, right? So, you know, if you only trust regression results, then, you know, you should switch off now. What I'm going to do now is to say, you know, I'm going to use that evidence, you know, and believe that evidence, and I'm going to try to make sense of that evidence through the lens of a model, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. And then I'm going to use that calibrated model to answer questions that I can't answer with regression tables. The parameters we want to estimate, right? So these are boring parameters that any model will need if you want to quantify it. And these are parameters that are more novel, that I haven't seen in the literature before, because they're the conduct parameters of responsible sourcing. So we want to know, you know, the evidence that we've estimated in the data, is it consistent with what number of cost increase related to low wage workers? Are there any potential gains to labor productivity more broadly in those suppliers? Is there a positive markup to the multinational, and how much of the cost is passed through to the multinational if there is any cost increase? And then, of course, we want to know, or we need to know, the demands that firms are facing. That's going to be useful for me to, in particular, back out this guy. Once I know the demand that firms are facing in this setting when they compete with one another, then I can use the observed drop in your sales. You were exposed relative to my sales. I was not exposed, to say something about the average cost increase. I need to know the shape parameter of the domestic productivity distribution, and that's going to pin down the magnitude of the selection effects we're going to find. So looking at the intensive margin versus the overall effect on sales, and the elasticity of substitution between worker types. That's going to be in the relative employment of these workers. Okay. So the way that we proceed is as follows. I'm going to use the sales effect on non-RS buyers. So I'm going to use this point estimate here, 4 years or after the sales, 4 years or after the exposed event. What happens to your sales to non-RS buyers? And that's just going to be a function of what is the demand that you're facing relative to firms that are also supplying into a given market, but that did not face an increase in responsible sourcing. So what I need to know is the elasticity of demand that firms are facing. Luckily, our co-authors, Isabella and Jose on this paper, have estimated that for the firms in our sample using the same data and an estimation consistent with our model. And they tell us that it's 5.03. And of course, right, I can give you counterfactuals across any value that you want, but we're going to use 5.03 as a baseline and use that to evaluate what I observe in the data, which I'm going to show you on the next slide, with knowing the demand that firms are facing and the cost share of low-wage workers in these firms' payment bills to estimate what the implied cost increases. And that's going to be roughly 12%. Now, once I know this cost increase, I can use three effects that I see in the data: the effects among compliers to the RSME, so the intensive margin. That is going to have the same, sales effect that I have here, but it's also going to have the degree of pass-through to the multinational and the extent to which the multinational sees an increase in its output demand. Okay, so two more parameters I want to estimate, and right now I have 2 moments. So we're going to have 4 moments in total, and I'm going to use 4 effects, right? The first parameter just comes from this 1 moment, and then I have 3 parameters that I want to estimate with 3 effects that I see in the data. And that's going to be the intensive margin response. It's going to be the effect on the total sales, the first event study I showed you, and it's going to be the effect on the multinational subsidiary itself. So this is how this looks in the data. These are these dashed lines that I saw you on the event study graphs that I just plug in for the counterfactual, for the comparative static in the model. And then we're going to solve for these parameters, which is down here. So roughly, like the evidence that we have with them through the lens of our model is consistent with a roughly 12% increase in the labor-related cost of low-wage workers. Almost no increase in demand to the multinational. That's the tiny, slightly negative point estimate, the statistical 0 that I've shown you on the last graph. A cost pass-through that's not perfect and not super low, about 0.8 of the cost is passed through to the multinationals. And the distribution parameter of the productivity distribution that governs the extent of the extensive margin, which is roughly in the middle of the existing literature, which is 6.2. So I just take 4 effects that I have in the data and solve them for 4 unknowns in the model, and that's how we calibrate the main conduct parameter of RS. What I also want to know is there a broad-based increase in labor productivity with a simple assumption that we make in the model that responsible sourcing cost increases apply to low-wage workers, but labor productivity increases are broad-based and apply to all worker types. We can just look at what happens to initially high-wage workers, and I've already shown you the event study on that, which is basically going to be 0. So we're not going to conclude that there's broad-based increases in labor productivity because I don't see increases in the earnings of high-wage workers. Now, of course, right, you can argue that the labor productivity increases could be concentrated among the low-wage group, and we can play with that as part of the quantification. And then finally, to estimate the substitutability between worker types, I take the relative employment response between initially low-wage and high-wage workers, and I'm going to allow for you stop employing low-wage workers altogether, the zeros in the data, and that makes the estimate that I showed you earlier, where it was just log on the intensive margin, slightly more negative, which is now close to 18%. What do I need to know? I need to know the relative cost shock, which we've estimated before, which is roughly 12%, and that leads to an elasticity of substitution of around 1.5, which again is close to recent estimates from papers in this literature. Of course, you can find papers where it's different. And then, the good thing about this part of the analysis is, like, once you calibrate a model, if you don't like, the rho we use, or if you don't like the sigma that we use, it is very simple for us, and that's what we do in the paper, to show you the counterfactual welfare results across any grid of parameters that you trust and believe in. So model-based sensitivity analysis, which we can do. So in the final minutes that I have, now we have the calibrated, we have the main parameters, including the conduct parameters. We have the transaction data, and we know, the extent of multinational rollouts by the end of our sample and how much of production is affected. And now we're going to use that model to solve for, an equilibrium where, we have the real wages of initially low-wage workers, of initially high-wage workers, and we can break them up into groups of workers that were exposed or that were employed at exposed firms ex ante. And we can, solve for the equilibrium without responsible sourcing, and then going to an equilibrium that has the extent of responsible sourcing that I see at the end of my sample, which is this roughly 38% effect. And that's the perimeter of the main counterfactuals that we're facing. And that brings out just a chart of the welfare incidence of this broken up by worker types. So the most eye-popping one here is that if you focus on the dark blue ones for now. So in the dark blue, the only thing that happens is that multinationals impose responsible sourcing to the extent that we see it with the cost parameters that we've estimated only on the suppliers, and that's the blue bar. So you see that workers that were working in the initial non-responsible sourcing equilibrium at firms that would end up being exposed, so selling to the fraction of multinationals that roll this out, not conditioning on the lucky ones that get to stay there, but just the group, like the intent to treat effect. they see their welfare go up by roughly 8%. However, workers in the same group, so 70% of low-wage workers, 30% end up being exposed in the economy at the end, and then 70% are not, due to indirect knock-on effects. So basically, labor market and price index effects. They see a decrease in their earnings. And what's the main intuition? In aggregate, labor demands for the now more expensive factor of production is going down, and that decreases the going wage rate compared to the equilibrium without responsible sourcing, where not 40% of production roll out these policies. And the domestic price index increases to the extent that those 40% of producers produce for the domestic sector as well as for multinationals and exporting, and that is the case in the data. So both of these things lead to a negative general equilibrium effect on non-exposed low-wage workers, which is the majority of low-wage workers. And then in the aggregate, you see that the effects are very small in Russia, but you have these distribution implications. So the same pattern of results in general equilibrium holds if we allow for an equilibrium where, so the blue is our main comparative, is our main counterfactual. In the blue one, we assume that multinationals had already rolled out these responsible sourcing contracts for their own workers. So they had already implemented, wage, working conditions in their own production facilities that were above the going rate, which is consistent with sort of corporate social responsibility 1.0 and existing evidence that multinationals pay a premium. And then we show you the effects on domestic workers if they only extend that to their suppliers, which is what we think of as responsible sourcing. But we can also do a counterfactual where the workers in the multinational sector themselves over the same period get exposed to these better working conditions. And of course, what you're going to see is that the asymmetry is going to go up. Why? Because a broader segment of the labor markets is now exposed to these policies. So the general equilibrium consequences are going to be stronger, and the direct gains to the exposed workers are going to be smaller because they're also going to be, right? The exposed workers get both the general equilibrium effects, but they also get the wedge and the tau that's landing in their pockets. And the non-exposed workers only get the general equilibrium effects, which are negative. And since I'm running out of time, with that, let me conclude and answer any remaining questions. We're trying to learn about responsible sourcing both in the theory and in the data, and we're trying to combine the data that we have as best we can with the model that we've written down. And I hope this is going to be useful. And by no means the last paper on this topic. It's like I think of it more as an interesting starting point to think through these effects more seriously. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, are there any questions to the speakers?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Benjamin. This is Long. So I would like to summarize again. So what do we exactly learn from this? So basically, we understand that to impose responsibilities on the value chains it seems to be a big trend in ESG stuff. Now, you seems to suggest that this could be inefficient. So what do we learn from this? What would be your recommendation? We couldn't just point out that we understand that the impact would be unequal, right? So exactly what would be your recommendation?
Yeah, I love that question. I think we should ask these questions much more frequently in academic seminars. So I can tell you what I learned in this process. So number one, I wasn't at all convinced that in a country setting, like a middle-income country setting like Costa Rica, with which, as I said, is broadly understood to have strong regulations and strong institutions. I could have fully imagined that the results in Costa Rica would have been it's just hot air. It's just not binding. These things are advertisement devices, like advertisement devices to signal that you're a good citizen, and then they don't really do anything on the ground. So surprise number one for me is like even in a middle income setting, and even in a high middle income setting like Costa Rica, it doesn't seem to be hot air. At least we can't explain what what we found in these event studies without something happening to these suppliers. And then in partial equilibrium, if you just looked at these exposed suppliers, you would be like, oh, this is terrible, right? Like firm sales are going down, employment is going down, like what's happening? And then of course some workers are gaining more. So then you come to the general equilibrium implications. And, again, like we want to be clear here, right? I don't have causal identification on the general equilibrium simulations that we run through the model. So you should think of that, right, as like much more theory oriented and indicative rather than like, we now know it's 8% for the non-exposed workers. So in there's a number of lessons I would take away. That is like, responsible sourcing is going to be context specific in terms of the welfare implications it's going to have. And that sounds like what a politician would say, but it's definitely something we were not super clear on when we started writing this paper. So if responsible sourcing has the scale of having the potential of general equilibrium effects on labor markets and output markets, then what would come out as the intuition in our kind of study? Like, number one, you can have unintended and in particular negative implications on the same workers, the group of workers that you're trying to benefit, to those that are not directly benefiting or exposed to these codes of conduct. And in general, you should be concerned about such negative knock-on effects on domestic labor and pricing these days in an environment where the cost of responsible sourcing is not passed through fully to the multinationals. And number two, where a lot of the producers that are affected by those responsible sourcing policies are not just producing for export markets, but are producing for local, either intermediate input consumers or local consumers. Those are the kinds of things that I would take away from this.
Yeah, so yeah, I think I really appreciate that. In general, the general equilibrium effect, like a proper understanding of the economy is frequently underappreciated by policies, and we really see this in a lot of settings. So I think that's probably the key things we can take from this.
Thanks. Yeah.
Professor Faber, I'm wondering, because there is a significant wage increases in your estimates after the RS policy, correct? Mm-hmm. And we know that if there is a wage increase, then there must be people losing their jobs. I'm wondering whether these people affected by the policy whose jobs are lost, are included in the welfare analysis too, because I didn't go to the details of the model.
Yeah, great question. So first, I would push back a little bit on in a neoclassical world where labor markets are perfectly competitive, then if you see an exogenously imposed wage increase, you're going to see unemployment. Right. If you have imperfectly competitive labor markets, that's not super clear. And like we wanted to at least entertain that possibility. We don't find strong evidence for it. So we are in your world. So the wage increase is going to leave some workers to be fired from those firms, and also in the aggregate, labor demand going to be reduced for these workers. So the short answer is yes. So the group of exposed workers is the group of workers that were working at suppliers before the responsible sourcing was rolled out. So the average welfare numbers for that group is the intent to treat effect, including workers who lose their jobs and don't get lucky enough to benefit from whatever TAU may be flowing in their direction. So yes, it's in there.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, yeah, the time is up. So yeah, thanks for the speaker again. It's like a wonderful presentation, has a lot of implications. And yeah, thanks to the audience also for active participation. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks for all the questions and comments. That was great.
Yeah.